Welcome, everybody, to another installment of Quaker Libertarian Conversations. Once again, here with Jared Warner and Juliet Nail. This is Matt Hisrich, and looking forward to today's conversation. We're going to tackle the question, can you be Quaker and Christian and Libertarian? Let's take a moment to center down. All right. So this is a hot topic, one I think that many of us have heard questions about or wrestled with ourselves. For me, what it often boils down to when I'm asked about it is two primary points of concern. And I don't know if some of you may have seen this Onion article years ago about libertarian convention, and it has two guys sitting in a living room with a couple of 2-liters, and the one is like in a tie-dye t-shirt and says, legalize weed. He's holding a sign. The other guy is like this corporate guy in a business suit, and he says cut taxes. And these are kind of the two poles of what is often conceived of as libertarianism. Basically, libertine, anything goes, no morality, and keep government out of any kind of decisions along those lines. And corporate greed. Once again, no societal controls on people's desire for more money, more things. Consumerism, all of those kinds of things. And when people think about those two things, no sort of legal framework for morals and no legal framework for control of corporate greed. They say, how in the world can you reconcile this? If this is sort of the outsider perception of libertarianism with Christianity, seems impossible. Is there any way to do it? What do we think?
Yes. I've had many conversations over this topic of and I'm from an evangelical branch of Quakers, so the question isn't necessarily just Quaker. How can you be Christian and be a libertarian, because they do think that it's anything goes, and where are the morals and that sort of thing. And when I think of things like the golden rule, do unto others what you'd have them do to you, that sort of thing, and I look at what a lot of libertarians are espousing to, it fits to me. I mean, one of the organizations that tries to promote liberty-minded thought is Free the People, and one of their slogans is don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. I mean, that almost is the golden rule, if you ask me. So that really resonated with me, and that's kind of as I approach my walk of faith, I take that same mindset. If I'm trying to force somebody into believing as I do, are they really believing, or are they just trying to avoid a fight? And if they're just avoiding a fight, is it really faith? And I just personally, I think you can't force somebody. You can just answer questions and encourage and try to live a different sort of lifestyle in front of them so that they can make their own decisions.
Well, and I really appreciate, I find what you're saying, Jared, to be super appealing. That's where I am. And then Matt, where you came in, the structure that you provided is really helpful, because I think that's the crux of it. It's not, in my opinion, libertarianism isn't a lack of structure. It's a lack of mandated structure at the point of a gun. And I feel that the current system, and maybe I'm wrong, but in the reading that I've done, the current system actually prevents fair structures from coming up because it protects big businesses or cronies from competition from smaller organizations coming up. So I personally think that a libertarian society gives you more structure, more accountability. It doesn't mean if Jared, if you go off and murder someone, it doesn't mean you're not accountable. So I think it might be interesting for us. Well, I don't know if this is the podcast to talk about that in, or a future one, but maybe looking at, what are those ways of being accountable? Because that's what did it for me. And when you have the testimonies, I just felt like the peace, simplicity, like you said, the golden rule, you can only have that, in my view, in a libertarian, ideally anarchist society, because you've always got that threat of force, like you said, in our current system. Now, that doesn't mean burn it down right now. It's let's build up what we want so that people no longer see the need for what's there. So.
Yeah, I think that, so you both said a lot that resonates with me, and not surprisingly, right? It strikes me that when, several things. So when I look at the, particularly the New Testament, but I think you can look at this through Old Testament lens as well and come to similar conclusions. The sort of focus on the state as where morals are developed, maintained, society is held together. It isn't there. Like you can't really read through the Gospels and the letters and say, okay, primarily what they're doing here is to try to develop a, as Juliet said, a mandated structure of morality. No, it's about moral persuasion. It's about having conversation, bringing people into a better place, a better way to live. So that definitely is where I come at it from. What is morality? And Murray Rothbard, famous libertarian thinker, has a quote along the lines of, there is no moral choice that isn't a free choice. And to some extent, I guess my concern is when we look to enforce any kind of moral position through the state, that's like a shortcut for us. We don't have to do the work of trying to work with our neighbor to bring them into some sense of moral duty or whatever. We just vote for it. And we say we've done our task, and we wait till the next election if we don't figure it out this time. But I think there were those who would say, okay, that's all fair and good, but what do you do about people who aren't willing to play by the rules? And what about the harm that they might inflict? We need this structure.
Yeah. When I think of structure like that, my mind always goes to the book of Judges, because I'm a pastor and I read the Bible first and then I read other books. And I always found it interesting. Most people look at Judges as a negative book. And there's a verse in there that says, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And I've always thought, wow, that sounds amazing. So, and then when they went to get a king, they were saying, one of the warnings that the prophet gave was they're going to take your men and take them to war, and they're going to take your taxes and that to support their own things. So it went from everyone did what they thought was right in their own eyes, and then you're going to have this king that's going to take everything from you and send you off to war, and you're going to have to listen to him. And I like, okay, they chose the king for some reason because they wanted to be like everyone else, yet they had liberty beforehand. And yeah, it didn't always work out, but they lived for, I think, 300 years under judges. And when the need the need was there, a judge was emerged and helped them see the trouble through, and then they went back to the regular life as they saw fit, so to speak. So I think in a religious point of view, there is a precedent where liberty-minded lifestyles is seen as being beneficial. But a lot of us look at that framework because we like hierarchy for some reason, because our history is mainly through a European monarchical hierarchy with kings and that sort of thing. And then, of course, democracy and republic, the republic and all of that, where we think that somebody has to be in control. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, is my point of view. And if everyone lived as they saw fit, and also was mindful of those around them, then we could have a freer society.
It was James Madison who I think had this quote about something along the lines of, if men were angels, there would be no reason to have government, but essentially they're not, so we need something to restrain them. And if it wasn't him first, I know Robert Higgs has sort of turned that on its head, and others have done the same, to say, if men aren't angels, why would you give them so much power and authority over other people? Because guess who runs government? Human beings, right? So you're essentially enabling those who might abuse that power by giving them greater power. Now, that's a libertarian perspective, but I think the sort of if men were angels concept is very strong. And the old critique of libertarians, at least in the last couple decades, if you want to be a libertarian, go move to Somalia. You have as much freedom as you want.
Well, I mean, so that brings up kind of two things: the Quaker aspect of, Quakers want social justice, peace, simplicity, blah, 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 blah. And again, this is the emphasis for Quakerism, right? Libertarianism, we're emphasizing the freedom piece, but you can't really, I think what we've talked about before is you can't have one without the other. And your example of Somalia, but it's like, yeah, but they have a government. It's a failed government. But I guess my question is how, can we give some examples that show, and that would not convince, but, showing people what that accountability could look like, or where do we have that accountability now in our society that's not done with government? Like, how do you have justice? How do you have, what do you do with someone who's murdered someone in a free society, a free and peaceful society, right? So I don't know. Do you guys have answers for that?
I defer to Matt.
Well, so I mean, there are layers to this, and you spoke about this a little bit earlier, Juliet, where it's okay to say, I think, tomorrow everything's just gone, the government's just gone, figure it out. And I don't think most libertarians anyway would say, oh, that makes a lot of sense. So if that's not the case, do we begin with setting loose all the murderers and seeing what happens, or do we find areas where we can expand personal freedom and moral choice? So I think that would be where I would start at it, is to say, okay, let's continue to build a voluntary society in the ways and where we can, as opposed to saying, okay, we all have to agree on the final endpoint and before we do anything. But you're right. I think that that's often where the debate ends up of, okay, well, what do we do about X that's currently handled by the justice system or whatever. But I think, to that point, if we want to go there, there's lots of discussion, certainly not all libertarians, about saying the way our justice system is currently running is not yielding justice in society, right? There are a lot of problems here, whether we're talking about the death penalty, whether we're talking about the number of people behind bars, how cases are played out in the justice system. One thing after another where people were saying, wait a minute, maybe this isn't working. Now, do you just say, let's scrap it and be done with it? Or do you say, okay, well, let's see how we scale some of this back if it's only causing problems, or if it's causing a lot of problems, in addition to solving some problems, what can we do differently? So that would be the way I would respond to that, and maybe it's a cop-out, I don't know.
Well, and I have some ideas, but Jared, do you have any specifics in your reading that you've come across, or examples in the world of where this is already happening, where people are being held accountable outside government?
There are several examples of greater liberty. If you look at some of the Eastern European countries, as the fall of communism happened, some of them took a greater liberty stance and others stayed in a more authoritarian type mindset. And if you look at the growth of their economies in the early 90s to 2000s, the ones that were more liberty minded grew at a greater percentage than the ones that were more authoritarian. And I was trying to look up which country it was that was one of the highest. I know what their flag looked like. It's like black, silver, and blue. I think it's Latvia or something like that. And they allowed for more personal freedom and less government because they came from an authoritarian sort of mindset and they didn't want that. So they tried as far to the other side as they could. And, is it perfect? Probably not. But the people there have a little more than the people in the neighboring country that did something differently. And I mean, if you look at early American history during the colonial periods, the ones that had more liberty grew at a greater rate than some of the others. New York, for example, was a very liberty-minded colony, and it's the largest city in the country still today. Whereas some of the other colonies didn't grow quite as much. And Philadelphia was in the Quaker colony, and it's still the sixth largest or fifth largest city in the country. So they began with a fairly liberty-minded structure, and it paid off. Of course, history has changed as we've evolved as a people, but I think when they started out, a lot of them started with liberty-minded ideas, and it benefited for quite a few years.
Well, and we have an episode on that Quaker colony and libertarianism. So I forget what episode that is, maybe episode 2, maybe. Well, okay, so I totally agree with you. And I'm thinking of things like, when you have competing mediation services, right? We already have that. Or if you had, if our interactions, I still go back to the whole insurance thing and the whole liability. So if you have no protection from liability, you're going to want either an insurance or a mutual aid cooperatives. So whether they're profit or nonprofit, you're going to want to collect together with your neighbors or, people wherever and share liability, right? So, I mean, I think of that as a place where if if these people are going to share, whether it's a business or, people that's a co-op, you're going to decide these rules together, and they're going to be binding. They're going to kick you out, or you're going to kick someone out if they don't follow the rules. So I see that as a place for structure and rules. And then I don't know if Robert Hicks talks about this, but the whole contract thing, if we're going to work together, I'm going to have, we're going to have some sort of agreement. When I teach my classes, when I have on-site classes, I have to pay insurance myself, which I don't have to when I work for a big corporation. I have more liability than they do. And then I have people sign waivers that they're not going to sue me if, and I make sure that I'm telling them, like, look, it's your body. Don't do anything I tell you to do that doesn't feel right. So I think that there are, everything that happens today that's of value, we could pay people directly, right? Whether it's social services, there's definitely social services that I'd be willing to pay for myself, or even cooperatively as a charity for people who need it, right? Mm-hmm. So I just want them to compete. Like, and this is a crazy idea that I've had as an intern, is like, why can't we change our tax code to, instead of paying, so not really an anarchist solution, but a way to get where we want to go, is say you can do whatever you want in government, but the taxpayer gets to decide where their money goes. So just make it a flat rate, flat tax. And then what your accountant does, your accountant kind of tells you all the different government things, and then you pick where that funding goes. So I don't know. That's my fantasy of an intern solution. Otherwise, let's compete,
Sounds fun. Make tax season a whole lot more fun.
Wouldn't it? My tax accountant liked the idea.
To get us back to the kind of impetus for the conversation here, is there or do you see a fundamental tension between what Jesus was trying to do, what the early disciples were trying to do, and a libertarian framework of understanding? One thing that gets thrown out a lot, I think, in conversations around this is Acts community and sharing everything in common, and any concept of private property, private ownerships really goes against that. My response to that is, of course, well, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but it was a voluntary community. This wasn't somebody, again, to your point, Juliet, that was enforcing at gunpoint that you have to do this. And to say that is some sort of biblical model for how we should structure our government, I think is a real stretch. But I think there would still be those who would say, what Jesus is talking about and trying to accomplish is wholly at odds with the libertarian understanding. And what do you say to that? What are your talking about points or responses in those conversations?
I think there's a better thing than even Acts that we can look at. In Matthew, Jesus talks about how to get along with other people. When you have a conflict or a brother sins against you, he has steps that you're supposed to take to build to reconcile each other in the community. So he says, if a brother sins against you, go to your brother in private and talk it through. And if you can work it out, then you've gained a brother. If not, then take the next step, which is bring 2 or 3 witnesses with you and talk to them. And if you can work it out, then you've gained a brother. If not, then go to the next step, so to speak, which is bring it to the community and let the community talk things through, work it out. And if you can come up with a solution, then you've gained a brother, you've built unity, and the community is stronger. If not, then treat them like a sinner or a tax collector. Probably not. And then everybody looks at that and they're like, well, how do you treat a sinner and a tax collector? Well, you're trying to bring them into the community and encourage them to join the community. So I think that structure is more of what Christ wanted to instill in our way of living, more so than Acts chapter 2, where they're all living in a utopian environment where everybody has everything and they're all living in common and giving everything to each other. I think that's how to live with one another is a conversation. It's a relationship. You have to work it through. And you see this even in like family court when unfortunately divorce does happen and kids are involved. How do you determine visitation time between the two parties? Usually now the parents are sent to a mediator before they go to court. And if you can come to some sort of conclusion during that mediation time frame, then that's what the judge will sign off on. And that happened in my life when with my first child, we never did go see the judge. We worked everything out together, and it was worked everything from child support to visitation time and all of that. So, and there are ways that we can do things together without involving a heavy-handed sort of, this is what you're going to do. So I think when we only say that government can do it, we're limiting ourselves.
I totally agree with that. And when I get confronted with this, in my mind, we kind of touched on this when we did our podcast on Christianity, or well, I guess it was kind of the way when we talked about John, and how we were trying to be like Christ, and how the whole point of Christianity is to be like Christ. If the point is to be like Christ, we can't sometimes, if we sit and center what we want to do or what we need to do or what we think we're supposed to do is going to be in line with what a government may say. Sometimes it's not. So we kind of talked about how the higher calling was always to do, what we felt Christ or God is calling us to do. So I would say, point is it has to be voluntary, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if you don't, so I kind of turn it on its head is, if you think of libertarianism as either just libertine or the crony that's just trying to be greedy and it's Darwinistic, I can see how people would be confused. But that's not what libertarianism is. Libertarianism actually naturally, it technically allows that, but it naturally, both the corporatist and the libertine person also has to live with the full consequences of those actions. Mm-hmm. So you can make all the money you want in a libertarian system as long as you're not hurting other people. Because if I pollute your river, I'm going to be 100% liable. So actually, I think you are, again, it's more accountable. But the other aspect of stewardship, well, I guess it's not a but, it's an and, that aspect of stewardship, if we're supposed to take care of each other and the land, and the structures of our society, if we're outsourcing it, we forget about it and don't do it. Where if we are responsible for this small group of people in our little co-op, we're going to step up to the plate. So I actually love your example of the kids, because no matter what government says, the parents both have a stake. So one way or another, they're going to figure it out. And I think that's what it comes down to, is you're only going to do stuff if you have a stake in it. And sometimes that stake is feeling good. Quakers, we like to feel good. We want to help people. We want peace. We want simplicity. We want justice and equality. So if we want those things, it's in our interest to help other people. So to me, not only is it not incompatible, to me, government is incompatible with Christianity, because you're outsourcing your responsibility to each other to somebody else. So I don't know. That's my rant.
Well, the question about just profiteering and that sort of thing, just the greedy capitalist. I mean, how many of us have ordered something off of a Facebook ad and not gotten the product? You know, I've had it happen once. I've ordered several things off of Facebook, and several of them I questioned whether I was going to get them or not. And I eventually got one of my Christmas presents, and I think I got it July 4th or something like that. So it said it was on its way, but you learn that that's not a business that I want to deal with. So if you have a bad interaction with somebody in a business sense, you're not going to do business with them again. So even in a purely greed-based economic system, there are going to be those instances where the greedy capitalist, for lack of a better word, has to take a step back and do something for their customers, or else they're going to lose their business. So there are checks and balances just within our own behavior that we will implement because of what we stand for. And in the Quaker history, you know, if you look at like Levi Coffin and some of the people during the abolition movement, they did everything that they could to not support the areas that they morally couldn't support. So they would put their money where their mouth was, so to speak. And I'm not from that area, so I don't know everything that they did. But from what I've read, they wouldn't sell certain products because it was produced in a way that they didn't feel was morally acceptable. So they would go to other sources of product. And that's another way that we can encourage better lifestyles, is just by being free to choose what we want to support and what we don't want to support.
Well, isn't that actually, I mean, didn't Quakers become wealthy specifically because they were honest and had integrity in Philadelphia and were known for that? Wasn't that part of the...
From my understanding, yeah. My family's not wealthy, but that's because we moved to the dry lands of Kansas, and and it didn't rain. So, but I don't know, Matt, you're from that area where the coffins were a little more. Maybe you know more about the history of that, but.
Oh, I mean, there's a whole rich history. This could be another episode, in fact, of kind of Quakers in business. You know, the Cadburys and the Barclays, and there was a real rich tradition of maintaining integrity in business. And you know, the whole idea of a set price really comes out of the Quaker tradition, because you didn't want to have to haggle every time you went and no, this is just what it costs. So there's a lot there, I think, to explore, and as part of some of the richness that I think perhaps has been lost over time as we think about what it means to be a Quaker. I also think your point about hierarchy, Jared, is important too, because as we think of sort of particularly European history, you know, there's war after war after war fought under a monarchy, and eventually moving into republics, largely around religious causes. And it wasn't differing religions necessarily, it was different interpretations of Christianity. And if we don't think about that as, okay, there's morality, a Christian moral framework can still lead down very bad paths. We learned something. And the replacement, unfortunately, in Western society is just simply to say, we're going to take religion out of the public sphere altogether. And I think, perhaps not surprisingly for Quaker libertarians, to think, what's a radically decentralized view of how we do this, as opposed to saying, okay, we have to all agree on some sort of basic moral framework that's non-religious in any context. I think that creates its own problems, but we're at time. And so it makes me think we have more conversation in the future around
I think so. Maybe a little bit.
Any
Well,
last?
and my kind of wrap up is to just when people do bring up this objection is Quakers, because we're non-hierarchical in general, most meetings and most governance, and you guys in kind of, I didn't know that the evangelical Quakers were that way as well. You know, we actually Quakerism provides a super good structure of how to do things voluntarily because we already do it. Another good example are the way that 12-step programs, you know, AA and all those are structured. It's all voluntary, and there is accountability built in. We have it in our meetings. We have it in, 12-step programs, in my understanding, have that as well. And it's all voluntary. So I think, yeah, there's more there, but I definitely, I see Quakerism not only as compatible, but necessary. For libertarianism as necessary for in my vision of Quakerism.
Okay, that's the final word. We will see you next time. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you. See you later.